So let's say you want to write some music. You're immediately faced with the musician's dilemma. You sit down at a piano, and it has 88 buttons, and they all do something slightly different. Which ones do you push to make the music come out? Well, there's a lot of options, especially if you want to use more than one note at a time. There's about 50 different chords in common use. There's 12 different keys. Each chord has usually 3 different inversions and 4 different voicings. It comes out as 7,200 combinations. And if you want to use a sequence of 2 chords, the number of combinations is 7,200 times 7,200, or 52 million. The number of options in music is so high that after just 21 chords, the number of possibilities is the same as the number of atoms in the universe, roughly. And yet, most pop music uses the same progression of 4 chords. Most country can get by with 2 chords, and some funk tunes can even get by with 1 chord. So, why? Well, in order to answer these questions, we turn to theory, music theory. But there's something strange about music theory. My only exposure to traditional music theory was a 1-semester class in high school, and even then I realized that it didn't even begin to explain the kind of music I like to listen to.
I got a right to sing the blues.
I like big band arrangements. I like vocal jazz harmony. I like 6-note chords. And they were telling us how to use 3-note chords, maybe 4-note chords at the most, and to only explain music that had already been extinct for 100 years. So I decided a few years ago, after learning to write music through trial and error and through transcription, the way most people learn to write music, I made my own theory from scratch. Pursued a lot of dead ends. And I do most of my music theory by spreadsheet. I've found spreadsheets to be the most useful way to solve most problems. And I came up with a theory that explains everything from Bach to the blues coherently, and there's actually theory behind it. It's not just a list of names that you regurgitate. The conventional music theory, it's being generous to call it a theory because it's not even a hypothesis, it's just a list of names. And I realized that music is not most of the things people have assumed music to be, based on tradition or based on ancient Greek philosophers. Music is not mathematical. It is not geometric, and it's not even part of nature. It is not natural. Music is perceptual, it is evolutionary, and it is human. It's unique to humans. But before destroying the conventional music theory, I want to at least bring you up to speed somewhat on what it is. So let's go over the basics of music theory in 4 minutes. There are 12 musical notes. At the 13th one, we're back to the starting note, 1 octave up. Octave means twice as high or low, but the same note. The distance between 2 different notes is called an interval, and there are 12. Minor second, minor third, major third, perfect fourth, tritone, perfect fifth, minor sixth, major sixth, dominant seventh, major seventh, and octave. Having fun with all these names? Each of the 12 notes can be the basis of a pattern of 7 notes called a major or diatonic scale. There are 12 different major scales, one for each of the 12 possible starting notes. Playing the same happy-sounding major scale, but starting on the third note down, makes it a sad-sounding minor scale. The white keys on the piano play this scale, and the notes are named after the first 7 letters of the alphabet in this scale: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and back to A again, which is why the white keys also play a major scale in the key of C. The black notes on the piano don't have their own names. This one is called G flat, named after the next higher note, or F sharp, named after the next lower note. A plain G could even be called an A double flat, or an F double sharp. While you contemplate the purpose of having 40 different names for 12 different notes, let's talk about chords. A chord is at least 3 simultaneous notes, called a triad. There are 2 kinds of chords: major, minor, diminished, and dominant. I know what you're thinking. Hey, that's 4 kinds. But no, that's only one kind of chord. The other kind is things like these we don't teach you about. But back to triads. You build triads in a major scale by skipping every other note, identified by Roman numerals going up from the bottom. A 1 chord is major, 2 is minor, 3 is minor, 4 is major, 5 is major, 6 is minor, and 7 is diminished. This arrangement of chords is the basis of functional harmony. When you play a 4 chord, followed by a 5 chord, you feel a thing called musical tension that is only resolved by playing a 1 chord. If you play a 2 chord, it's not as tense, but still resolved by the 1 chord. If you play it as a major chord instead, now it's not considered a 2 chord. It's called a secondary dominant, or 5 of 5, where your 5 chord is now considered the 1 chord of a different scale. So that's 5 of 5 of 1. No wait, that must have been 5 of 5 of 5. Wait, slow down! It must have been 5 of 5 of 5 of 5 of 5. We've stumbled into something called the circle of fifths. Each major scale turns into another one a fifth away by changing 1 note at a time in a pattern, eventually coming back to the original scale. Turning 1 major scale into another is called modulation. To summarize, each chord in functional harmony means something. Each has its own function that leads to tension and release. And if you play everything wrong all at once, as fast as you possibly can, you get jazz. So there you have it, the basics of music theory. Maybe it doesn't seem that bad. The theory basically is that music's based on the major scale. Classical music uses the right notes, and jazz uses the wrong notes. But did you notice something missing from that theory? Was there any explanation of why those are the right notes and the other notes are the wrong notes? Was there any explanation of how other forms of music work? Well, it turns out there's an ugly little secret about this kind of music theory. Not only does it not explain jazz, it doesn't even explain a lot of classical music. Now for the real story of functional harmony. Everything that guy just said is bullshit. It's not wrong, it's bullshit. And there's an important difference. It's a cover story that makes you think you have the answer without actually telling you anything useful. Consider what it doesn't explain. Well, first of all, it doesn't explain jazz at all. But it also never explains why functional harmony is based on this 7-note scale called major and not some other 7-note scale. Why not have music based on a blues scale? or an Arabian scale. It doesn't tell you why most scales around the world have exactly 7 notes, or why the 7 notes are chosen from a possible 12. Why not have a set of 8 notes, or 24? But even this concept of musical tension that it introduces. What is musical tension? And why does it take 2 major chords to make it? And why can't you just end your concert like this? Thank you. Good night. Well, because the audience will hunt you down and murder you if you try it. But you can end like that if you do it a certain way. So why does that work? You won't find the answer in any music theory class. And there's a lot more the theory doesn't explain. Why is this interval considered stable, but this one is considered unstable? And if it takes 3 major chords to modulate, and 13 to go around the entire circle, how come you can do the same thing with just 13 intervals? In functional harmony, only chords have function, not intervals. And how do we come to such certain conclusions so quickly with so little information? Here's 8 intervals per second. How about 12? You probably have some idea what scale that ended on, but I think 16 pushes the limit. Okay, you may be wondering if music theory is such bullshit. How did the great composers make such nice music with it? Well, let's take Tchaikovsky for example. He wrote nice music, and he died in 1893. Schenkerian analysis was invented in 1906. So there you go. Tchaikovsky's harmony may have died that day in classical music, but it lived on in that other harmonic vocabulary. Yep, you guessed it. Called jazz. So instead of the theory the original musicians used, schools teach a theory of harmony that came into existence just as harmony died in classical music. And the nasty little secret about it is that it was invented by Heinrich Schenker to prove the superiority of the master German composers like Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven. It doesn't do a very good job even of that. The first thing you learn in music theory class is that the theory applies to everyone except Bach. Now, I'm not interested in proving one music superior to another. I just want to know what people like to hear and why, so that I can make good music. So now I'll present my own hypothesis of harmony, but it's one that's based on a few things you hopefully consider obvious. One major question that scholars argue about endlessly is why song even exists. Why do we have music? Is it a mating display? Is it a memorization aid for tribal stories? Is it a social activity? Is it to scare off dangerous animals? And I think the answer is probably yes. But in terms of a theory of harmony, I think the important aspect is that it could be a social activity. Meaning that we're all sort of subconsciously obsessed with figuring out what we need to know to participate when we hear music. And I think the answer is obvious as to why. Because if you didn't sing and dance with the tribe, you didn't reproduce. So we figure out the rhythm, and we figure out the valid set of pitches for singing along. We have to be able to organize pitches and to imagine them, because tribal dance is kind of chaotic. But how do we organize them? Well, when we hear a beat, we subdivide it into double and triple. It seems like brains can only really count in 2s and 3s. A really fast beat becomes a pitch. and all the doubles are the same note in different octaves. But tripling a pitch produces a new note. If you do that over and over, you get a stack of new notes. This is the blank slate that our brains create to begin organizing the notes that we hear. But what are notes? Well, each note is its own stack of pitches called harmonics. A perfectly repeating sound, like a human voice, has harmonics that are multiples of one frequency. A stack of perfect harmonics sounds like this, a bit different from the stack of notes made by tripling. Notice you can still hear a ghost of the bottom note even with just two high harmonics playing. Other things that are struck or plucked like bells and guitar strings have imperfect harmonics. But the note recognizer doesn't require or even desire perfection. Or at least it didn't before auto-tune was invented. It just goes by the lowest, steadiest repetition in the note and calls that the pitch, which it then sends to the note organizer. But the recognizer has limitations. It can handle several notes overlapping, but no close clusters of 3 or more. It can't differentiate a pattern from that. So what happens in the organizer? It tries to match the notes from the recognizer to a pattern that it knows, a set of notes that we can use to sing along. And it begins with assumptions, starting with a 5-note stack of triples. If the notes begin to fit, but have more than one solution, we feel tension. The tension feels exactly like when someone doesn't finish there. Doesn't it? Any interval or chord that identifies a single solution relieves the tension. In the case of a 5-note solution, either a major or minor third identifies all 5 notes. But if another note comes in that doesn't fit, the organizer has some tricks. There is some ambiguity about pitch from the recognizer. Pitch can shift both with volume and with the speed of the source of the sound. So the entire current set of pitches can slide one note up or down. The other easy thing to do is to take a note off one end of the stack and stick it on the other end, causing the pattern to jump by a fifth, up or down. This group of chords makes your note organizer jump up and down. And this makes it slide up and down at the same time that it's jumping. But simultaneous notes can't be reconciled that way. So a note can be added to the stack, making a total of 6. This interval instantly triggers a 6-note solution. And if that doesn't work, a 7th note can be added. This interval triggers a 7-note solution, but it matches 2 different 7-note solutions, creating tension. And this is the reason why the interval is called unstable. A large number of possible solutions creates ambiguity, but the smaller the number, the greater the suspense until the real solution is found. Another name for the 7-note solution is the major scale. 2 major chords a major second apart define 6 notes that fall outside a 6-note solution. But the magic trigger interval is contained between the bottom note of the first chord and the middle note of the second. There are many hints that this is part of a 7-note stack, but we still feel tension. Why is that? Well, there's one other less likely possibility. An 8-note solution? Unfortunately, adding an 8th note to the stack creates a 4-note cluster. The note recognizing and organizing apparatus can't handle clusters, so the brain can never be forced to organize them. And the only 8-note scale with no clusters is really just a 2-note pattern that can't be used to organize anything. So, instead the organizer learns patterns based on a distorted 7-note stack. So in this sequence, the other possibility is a major scale with note 3 bent down. In a 12-note system, there are 66 possible 7-note scales, so why is that the only other option? Of those 66 scales, only 6 have no clusters. Of those 6, only 2 contain major chords a major second apart. The only note patterns the brain recognizes for harmony are the 5, 6, and 7-note stacks, and the 5 altered 7-note stacks: melodic major, minor, and diminished, and harmonic major, minor, and diminished. And these scales can do interesting things. They can transform into each other by sliding a single note at a time, up or down. Like chess pieces, they each have their own particular moves, easy transformations from one to another. In conventional harmony, there are only 2 transformations: the one that makes the major scale jump down and up. And you get to the more remote keys by doing that over and over. Major is unique in its ability to do that, to transform into all versions of itself. But there are literally hundreds of other ways to do the same thing, by adding the sharps and flats in a different order, moving through these other scales. You can turn major to melodic minor, a straight transformation, or turn melodic minor into harmonic minor. Or you can make the whole scale jump except for the bent note, turning melodic minor into harmonic major. Or you can make the entire modified scale jump, bent note and all. You can even do it over and over, making a pattern that seems random, but makes sense in a weird way. So to summarize, the way scales can move easily is to slide up or down by one note, to jump by a fifth up or down, or to bend one note at a time and transform. Even though you don't learn this stuff in music theory class, it's not new. This is music theory from 300 years ago, the kind used by the arch nemesis of music theorists, Johann Sebastian Bach. His music has confounded them for centuries, with all its wrong notes and rule breaking that somehow make sense in a weird way. Now you know what he was doing, sliding, jumping, and transforming these 6 scales. What makes music sound bad is clusters, and by using scales one at a time with no clusters, the music could never sound bad. In a magic trick, the actual trick is to disguise the ordinary thing that you're doing, and the artistry is in the execution. 300 years ago, the goal was to disguise the movement between scales, and it worked. So in this piece, what Bach did is use a different scale for each bar, each one containing the note C, and if you just play the scale starting with C, it sounds like this. A constant note is called pedal point, and the changing notes are called counterpoint. He used all 6 scales and arranged them to transform, slide, jump, and transform, or even to jump directly. The opening transforms from harmonic minor to harmonic major and back, then harmonic major to major, then major jumps and slides down. After that, he uses the melodic and harmonic diminished scales one after another. Now, this is bound to be controversial because these scales don't even have names in conventional music theory, and you know how much they love names. Further along, melodic minor jumps, but keeps the bent note constant, creating harmonic major. So now you know how the brain organizes notes into groups called scales. But what about simultaneous notes? And how does something as abstract as harmony express emotions like happy and sad? The answer is that it really doesn't. It simulates sounds with inherent meaning that could mean happy and sad in context. But the secret to harmony, and the reason it works so well, despite being such a new musical invention, is that it's based on what our brains are doing when we aren't listening to music. Remember the harmonic series? All perfectly repeating sounds consist of a stack of pitches like this. Notes played simultaneously simulate the harmonics of a deeper sound. And if you do your best to simulate a harmonic series on a piano, you end up with a melodic minor scale starting on the fourth note up, also known as the acoustic scale. But since our note organizers are running all the time, this is the scale we hear most of the time, even when a loud motorcycle or a fast car drives by. You can hear the different notes: root, fifth, third, second, and most importantly, seventh, which requires at least a 7-note stack to organize. It also means that mere exposure to deep sounds teaches the brain to create at least a 7-note solution and also to distort it to make melodic minor. And this is probably the reason we developed the ability to transform scales. Chords formulated like a harmonic series, using notes found within melodic minor, sound consonant, and the arrangement of notes is called the art of chord voicing. And the key is to keep the phantom note above the range of rhythm, above 20 Hz. Too low and the chord ceases to be treated by the ear as a single synthetic tone, and instead turns into a pile of notes. But back above the threshold again, it's a single tone. Chords that don't simulate a harmonic series, or use notes only found in the other scales, sound dissonant. Chords that occur low on the harmonic series and with well-tuned notes are interpreted as strong and loud by the recognizer. They simulate a very deep voice, essentially. If the bottom note of the chord coincides with the bottom note of the harmonic series the notes are from, it's definitely a strong chord. For instance, a major chord or a dominant 7th chord is strong. A more complex example is the major 9 chord, where actually the top note is the root of the harmonic series it's based on. But if you put the top note on the bottom, turning it into a suspended 9 chord, it's interpreted by the ear as strong. If the chord doesn't contain the root of the harmonic series, it's treated as weak, like the minor chord, for instance. This note would have been the base of the harmonic series, but it's not in the chord. Then there are chords like full diminished that don't fit any harmonic series. They're essentially noise, but still useful. They can make the phantom voice vanish into a fog and magically reappear somewhere else. The register of the notes also has inherent meaning because of our vocal ranges. High means child, medium means woman, low means man, and very low. What does very low mean? People singing together in harmony produce, essentially, the voice of God. Another type of meaning comes from the way we organize notes. Chords are made of notes, and notes imply or define scales. We feel frustration when they tell us nothing. Suspended chords exist in a 5-note stack, but don't identify a particular one. Either of these chords instantly identifies a 5-note stack, so they're inherently satisfying and very popular. It takes 2 of those to define a 6-note stack, but only one of these. Most people call it pretty, but actually, it's both weak and satisfying. It takes 2 of those to define a 7-note stack, but only one of these. Being a ugly, but very satisfying chord makes it very powerful. And this has confused people for a long time about dissonance. Another way chords can be expressive is through their transitioning from one to another. Thanks to millions of years of survival, we are hardwired to interpret changing sounds a certain way. Excited or approaching animals rise in loudness, rise in pitch and the sharpness of sound. Retreating or not so excited animals get quieter, fall in pitch, and make a dull sound. Yay and boo are exaggerations of this kind of natural meaning. So a strong sound or a raising of pitch raises our interest, implies energy and excitement, and makes us tense. A weak sound or a lowering of pitch reduces interest, implies sadness, and makes us relaxed. And if you do that with an ambiguous chord that doesn't define a scale, it drives us nuts. Something's going on, but we can't quite tell what. These chords are strong and weak, and in the right context seem happy and sad. They both exist in a 5-note stack in this relationship, and no other scale has them 1 note further apart. So if you play them that way, 1 note further apart, your mind will be forced to slide the entire scale to fit. You'll get an element of surprise, plus the inherent meaning that comes from the chord transition. If you go from strong to weak and make the scale go down, it should sound surprisingly sad. If you go from weak to strong and make the scale go up, it should sound surprisingly happy. Now let's do it with a transforming scale. Sad. Happy. This is the essence of how chords create emotion, simulating sounds with inherent meaning. And the voices of giants they simulate spring into existence and vanish again as the notes change. And as groups of notes, some chords can instantly define entire scales. We've already heard the example of the major chord defining an entire 5-note stack. A major 7 defines an entire 6-note stack. And minor 7 flat 5 defines an entire 7-note stack. It's not that these are the only scales that contain these chords. They're just the first matches in the chain of assumptions. This chord, for instance, only exists in melodic minor and drags your note organizer around by the ear, so to speak. This chord only exists in the 4 scales beyond melodic minor, but it doesn't identify a particular one. Whereas this chord only exists in melodic diminished. It has quite a few sour notes, but can still be satisfying because it's so specific about the scale. Contrast that with this chord, which occurs 21 times in all the scales. It basically tells you nothing. It's noise. So what's the difference between classical and jazz harmony? The answer is that there isn't any, really, except in what they try to convey and how they do it. Classical music underdefines scales and moves slowly, using suspense to entertain. Jazz overdefines scales and moves quickly, using surprise to entertain. But they both come from the same tradition and use the same principles. Whereas Bach used transforming scales one at a time, in the 19th century, composers began to superimpose them to create 8-note scales. These scales have clusters, which sound inherently silly when they're used for melody, like a kid who can't quite follow a real melody. Melodic and harmonic diminished combined to make the octatonic scale, a favorite of Russian composers, and the one that was used for making Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairies. Major combined with harmonic major became the basis of the big band sound and obnoxious commercial jingles, scales I call hokey major and hokey minor. Hokey because every other chord is noise, so the phantom voice created by the harmony is playing peekaboo. In addition to superimposing the scales to make the 8-note scales, people also discovered that melodic minor could be used for the same tricks as the major scale, using it in a circle of fifths, which makes chains of notes that go up and down at the same time. alternating between major chords and melodic minor chords allows this chromatic sliding sound common to the music of Steely Dan, but it really got its start in easy listening music. And that last chord, even though it's the same chord as two chords previous, the ear pulls it from a different scale, harmonic major, because that's the closer transformation. Same chord, different scale. So now we come to the difference between harmony and melody, and this is the key to jazz solos and most traditional forms of music, and even the blues. The 6 scales are how a brain learns to organize notes, especially when simultaneous notes force the more complicated patterns. If singing alone, we tend to stick to simple stacks. But historically, most melody is improvised against a sustained note, including a lot of pitch bending. It becomes a demonstration of the ability to play those unexpected notes or sing them, and somehow make those unexpected notes make sense. If you decorate the sound of a drone with a harmonic major, half the scale is boring. But if you take the interesting half and transpose it by a fifth, now the scale seems to jump up when going up, and seems to jump down when going down, exaggerating up and down, and happy and sad. Or how about something more modern, the blues? The harmony of the blues actually comes from harmonic diminished, which is the same as the blues scale, just missing the fourth. But actually the blues scale is every combination of jump and slide transformation minus the original note. The original note is the one played at the very beginning and avoided until the very end of your blues song. Blues came into being about the same time harmonic diminished made a comeback in classical music, courtesy of the octatonic scale. Is it a coincidence? Probably not. Mere exposure causes your brain to start finding patterns, and all it took was for the musicians who created the blues to hear some ragtime or Sousa marches that incorporated this type of harmonic color. But it wasn't new. Bach had already used these sounds 150 years previous. I wonder what would have happened if you invited J.S. Bach to your blues jam. Then there's jazz. Does this sound like something a jazz musician might play? All I did was line up all the scales that contain the chord tones and used all of the notes. A lot like the earlier demonstration where we heard 12 intervals per second, causing our brains to rapidly shift the scales around to fit the new notes. That's exactly what's happening here. All the new notes coming in from the solo part cause your brain to reinterpret the notes in the chord. And since there are so many different chords, each with its own particular group of notes that can decorate it, jazz musicians have their work cut out for them. So that's the hypothesis of harmony I've been working on for the last 3 years or so. It's based on the idea that the brain only deals with quantities of 2 and 3. The ear can't differentiate clusters of 3 or more notes. And musical emotion comes from simulating sounds that have inherent meaning. We automatically calculate all the musical possibilities and then choose the path that fits. Kind of like how a lightning strike works, where the cloud and the ground send out feelers, and where 2 of those connect, that's where the lightning bolt goes. I think the brain works basically the same way. It's the way that it works for things like language and humor. A bunch of ambiguous information causes our brains to calculate a bunch of solutions, and a surprise punchline makes us laugh. Why do we laugh? We didn't see it coming, which is scary, but it was harmless, and so we make a sound that's kind of like a modified cry. We call it a laugh. So what have I done? I've replaced a theory based on 1 scale and 7 chords with this one that has 8 scales and who knows how many chords. Or you could call it 8 pure scales and 9 composite 8-note scales. Though in the jazz example, for chords that came from the acoustic scale, I overlap 2 acoustic scales, like the drone in the Indian music, a root and a fifth, and that makes a 9-note scale. You might wonder if there are any other pairs of chords, like the 4 and the 5 chord, that automatically produce that musical tension. The answer is not really. That specific example works because it implies a major scale, but with melodic minor as a second possibility, but definitely beyond the 6-note scale. Another question might be whether these 2 new scales I've introduced, the melodic and harmonic diminished, have their own merit. Because there are plenty of examples of music based on major, based on melodic minor, and based on harmonic major and harmonic minor. And if you carefully check my demonstration of my new scales in the Bach C minor prelude, you'll find that you can explain the same notes by jumping to harmonic minor and then harmonic major. So, have I discovered anything new with these scales? Well, Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairies by Tchaikovsky is supposed to be based on octatonic, but I've gone back over it, and it seems to be based not on octatonic, but on the melodic diminished scale. It moves between melodic diminished and melodic minor. I couldn't find anything classical sounding that's based on harmonic diminished, my hypothetical blues harmony scale. So I made my own, a piece of music almost entirely in harmonic diminished. It has blues harmony and blues structure even, but it's disguised as classical. I call it the Red Pill Blues. See if you can guess when the pill starts kicking in.